Hi everyone! In this video we're going to learn how to name amines and amides. Now with amines there are actually two different ways we can name them. One is using the common naming method and the other is using the IUPAC naming method. So let's start with common naming. In this one it's very similar to how we named ethers. So basically, you're just going to alphabetically list the names of the alkyl or aromatic groups that are bonded to nitrogen, and then you'll just tack on the suffix amine at the end. Now, if you happen to have two of the same group bonded to the nitrogen, then you'll use di or tri prefixes. So if you had two methyl groups, it would be dimethyl. If you had three, it would be trimethyl, etc. So down below we have a few examples of different amines and their common names. So on the left, you can see we have a methyl group bonded to the nitrogen. So we would call this methylamine. In the second example, we have two methyl groups bonded to the nitrogen. So that's dimethylamine. And in the last example, we have an ethyl group on one side and a methyl group on the other. So we're going to alphabetically list those since they are different. So ethyl would come first and then methyl, and again, we just add amine onto the end. The other thing to note is that nitrogen always has three bonds, or three things that it's bonded to. So in our first amine, it has a methyl group and then two hydrogens. In the second example, the nitrogen is bonded to two methyl groups and a hydrogen. And in the third example, the nitrogen is bonded to an ethyl group, a methyl group, and a hydrogen. So remember, we can classify amines as primary, secondary, or tertiary. So if an amine is bonded to one alkyl group, it's primary. If it's bonded to two alkyl groups, it's secondary. And if it's bonded to three alkyl groups, it's tertiary. So let's classify each of these. So what type of amine is methylamine? Primary, secondary, or tertiary? Primary. It's bonded to just one group, or one alkyl group. What about dimethylamine? How would we classify that? Secondary. It's bonded to two alkyl groups. And then what about our last example, ethylmethylamine? How would we classify that? Also secondary. Bonded to two groups, ethyl and methyl. Now, how do we use the IUPAC naming scheme? So in this version, we're going to, as usual, name the longest chain that's attached to the nitrogen. Then we're going to replace the final E with amine, so super easy. And then we want to number the chain so that the carbon bonded to nitrogen has the lowest possible number so that we can tell people where nitrogen is actually attached. Then if there are other groups attached to that chain, we'll number the other groups. And let's say that you have, for instance, a secondary or tertiary amine. That would mean that there are alkyl groups attached to nitrogen, so we want to tell people that there are those extra groups that are attached to the nitrogen. So in order to do that, we're going to add an italic N as a prefix for a group on nitrogen, also called a substituent. So let's look at some examples down below. So on the left, we're going to find the longest carbon chain, and then we want to number it so that our nitrogen group has the lowest number possible. So I'm going to start on the right and work my way left. Okay, so that nitrogen is attached to carbon 2, and we have 5 total carbons. So if this were an alkane, we would call it pentane, but we're going to drop the E and add amine, so it becomes pentanamine. And then we're going to put a 2 in front to indicate that the nitrogen is attached to carbon 2. Now, in our second example, let's find the longest carbon chain. Easy peasy. Then we're going to number this so that the nitrogen has the lowest number possible. So that would be a 1. Now there are 4 carbons total, so normally we would call this butane, but because we have a nitrogen there, we're going to replace the E with amine. So that's butanamine, and the nitrogen is attached to carbon 1. So 1-butanamine. And then we have this methyl group that's attached to carbon 3. So we're going to put 3-methyl in front of that. And then in our last example, let me just make some room here. We've got, let's see, a 4-carbon chain again. So again, that would be butanamine. But this time, the nitrogen is bonded to carbon 2. Also, another difference here is that we have a methyl group that's bonded to nitrogen. So we're going to list that methyl group as N-methyl to tell people that the methyl group is not on the carbon chain. It's actually attached to the nitrogen. And then we'll end it with 2-butanamine to tell everyone that the nitrogen is attached to the second carbon on our 4-carbon chain. Okay, so what if you have an aromatic amine? Now you might remember back when we talked about benzene derivatives that if you do have a benzene ring with a nitrogen group attached, that is called aniline. So looking at our compound on the right, we again have a benzene ring with a nitrogen attached. So that is our aniline there. And then we also have an ethyl group on the benzene ring, and then a methyl group bonded to our nitrogen. So the way we're going to name this is, let's see, we want to indicate where the ethyl group is on the benzene ring. Now the nitrogen is going to automatically be on carbon 1. So then we're going to number the ring so that ethyl has the lowest number possible. So that's 2-ethyl. Now the methyl group is on the nitrogen, so we're going to call that N-methyl. And then we want to make sure that we're alphabetizing, so ethyl comes before methyl. So the full name is 2-ethyl N-methyl aniline. All right, so let's do some practice problems. So I'm going to give you 2 different amines, and I want you to try to name them using both the common name and then the IUPAC name. So there's our first compound, and our second one looks like that. Okay, so go through, see if you can name these on your own first using both the common method and the IUPAC method, and then we'll go over it together. All right, so let's start with the first one. So let's start with the common name first. So remember, with the common method, we're going to list all of the alkyl groups on either side. So in this case, we have a 3-carbon group on one side and then a 1-carbon group on the other. So as alkyl groups, we would call these propyl and methyl. Okay. Then we want to list them in alphabetical order. So what would come first, propyl or methyl? methyl. So we would just write methyl propylamine. Okay, now let's use the IUPAC method. So in the IUPAC method, we want to find the longest carbon chain. So that would be this 3-carbon chain. And normally we would call this propane if it was an alkane. But because there's a nitrogen attached, we're going to call this propanamine. And then we want to number the longest chain so that nitrogen has the lowest carbon number possible. So 1, 2, 3. And then we have this methyl group attached to nitrogen. So that would be N-methyl. So putting it all together, we've got N-methyl 1-propanamine. Now let's look at the example down below. So let's start by using the common naming method. So we just want to list the groups that are on either side or just one side of the nitrogen. And in this case, there's only one alkyl group, this 4-carbon chain. And we're going to call that butyl. But notice there's a chlorine attached. So let's number this chain so that the chlorine has the lowest number possible. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 2-chlorobutyl. And then there's nothing else bonded to nitrogen, so we're just going to add amine to the end. So the full name is 2-chlorobutylamine. Now let's use the IUPAC method. Okay, so we want to find the longest carbon chain. We only have one carbon chain and it has 4 carbons. So normally we would call that butane, but because there's a nitrogen, we're going to add amine. So it's butanamine. And then it looks like the nitrogen is bonded to carbon 1, so that would be 1-butanamine. And then again, we're going to put that 2-chloro in front. So the full name is 2-chloro-1-butanamine. Okay. So not too bad. It can get a little overwhelming with having the 2 different methods of naming. But as long as you use one method or the other, then that's fine with me, as long as it's correct. Now let's move on to amides. So with amides, we're actually going to base the name off of the what would be the carboxylic acid name. And then we're going to drop the ic ending for the carboxylic acid, or the oic ending, depending on which method you're using. And we're just going to change that to amide. So, for example, if we look at this carboxylic acid here, there's only one carbon, so we would call that methanoic acid, right? And then we're just going to replace that OH group with our NH2, and now we have our amide functional group. So to name this, we're just going to replace oic acid with amide. So now it becomes methanamide. Now, there are common names for these as well. The common name for methanoic acid is formic acid. So then we would just replace ic acid with amide, and it would become formamide, or formamide, depending on where you put the emphasis. But I'm just going to focus on the IUPAC name. I think it's a little easier to name. Now, down below, we have the example of benzoic acid, and that's the common and IUPAC name. And if we replace that OH on the carboxylic acid with NH2, now we have our amide functional group. So this would, then we would replace oic acid with amide, and it becomes benzamide or benzamide, depending on how you want to say it. Okay, so not too bad as long as you know how to name carboxylic acids. Now, let's say your amide has other groups attached to the nitrogen. Well, we're just going to use that same method that we were using before. We're going to put an italic N in front of the group name. So, for example, down below we have our 1 carbon. So, if this were a carboxylic acid, we would call this methanoic acid, right? But because there's this nitrogen group attached, we're going to replace oic acid with amide. So that gives us methanamide. Then we also have this methyl group attached to the nitrogen. So we're going to label that N-methyl to tell people that the methyl group is attached to the nitrogen. So then we get N-methyl methanamide. And again, this is the IUPAC name. You can also use the common name N-methyl formamide, but let's just focus on the IUPAC name. Now, in the next example, we have a 2-carbon chain in our amide. And then we have 2 methyl groups bonded to nitrogen. So let's focus on the end of the name. So since there are 2 carbons, normally we would call this ethanoic acid for the carboxylic acid, but we're looking at an amide here, so we're going to replace oic acid with amide. So that becomes ethanamide. Then each of these methyl groups are attached to the nitrogen. So we're going to list NN twice and separate them with the comma because again, we have to be redundant here. And then we're going to say dimethyl. So the full name is NN dimethyl ethanamide. So let's do some practice problems. So I'll give you a couple of compounds. And I want you to try to name these on your own first. So you can pause the video once we're done drawing these out. And when you're done, you can unpause the video and we'll go over them together. Okay, let's start with the first one on the top. So we're going to pretend that this is a carboxylic acid instead of an amide, and then we can name it according to that. So we've got a 3-carbon chain here. So, let's go all the way back. If this were an alkane, we would call this propane, right? And really all we're doing here is we're just dropping that E and adding amide. So it's propanamide. But, you can also base it off of the carboxylic acid. So if this were a carboxylic acid, the ending would be propanoic acid. And then we'd just replace the oic acid with amide. So either way kind of works. Okay, so then let's see, is there anything else attached? Nope. This amide just has 2 hydrogens attached, so we don't have to list anything else. So this is just propanamide. Super easy. Okay, Well, maybe not that easy, but you get the idea. All right, so now let's go to the next one. So we're going to find that longest carbon chain. There's 2 carbons there. And by longest chain, I mean the one that includes the carbonyl group, because sometimes you might see a long chain connected to nitrogen and not the carbonyl group, but we're really focused on the carbonyl group here. All right, so if this were an alkane, we would call this ethane, but because there's that carbonyl group and the nitrogen, we know that this is an amide. So we're going to drop the E and add amide. Ethanamide. Now this time we do have a group bonded to nitrogen, so we're going to call that N-methyl. So putting it all together, this is N-methyl ethanamide. Okay, now what's really great about amide names and also amine names is that, let's say I gave you the name and you had to figure out the compound and draw it. Luckily, amide and amine are pretty obvious, so you'll know exactly which functional group you're dealing with. With esters and carboxylic acids, it can get a bit confusing at times because with carboxylic acids, the ending is oic acid. With esters, if you're using the IUPAC method, the ending is O8, so 8. So it can get a bit confusing with those, but at least with amines and amides, it's pretty obvious which type of compound you're working with. Okay, so that's it for naming. Next time we're going to start getting into some physical properties of all of these different types of molecules. So I will see you then.